So welcome to another Porch session. I am the host and interlocutor today. My name is Emily Murphy. I'm an assistant professor of digital humanities, and I'm sitting here with Karis Shearer, who's associate professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies. I'd like to begin by giving a land acknowledgement that we are on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Syilx Okanagan peoples. And I'm very grateful to be able to talk to Karis today on these lands and to be able to talk about her work and some of our shared work. Yeah, so Karis, I thought that we could talk today about a few things. You have a very exciting recent collection out that I'd love to talk about. But maybe we'll then also get into to some of the work that is yours, and then kind of some of the things that we work on together as well. Would you please like to tell us about Wanting Everything, the collected works of Gladys Hindmarch? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I happen to have the copy of it right here.
Wonderful. With evidence that it has been read.
Indeed, it is my working copy. Yeah, thanks. This is a collected work, so it's about just under 500 pages that Deanna Fong and I edited. We started in about 2018. It was a two years worth of work, and it was published in April 2020. And so it was our collaboration as editors, but we also worked with the author, Gladys Hindmarch, which was just such a pleasure. So really the three of us. And it collects her work really from almost like to childhood, some of her early writing. Yeah. Her writing as an undergrad, which is just amazing to look back and to think like, you know, she was writing this type of work when she was an undergrad. She won the second prize in an international contest when she was an undergrad at UBC and was like flown to New York as part of the magazine prize. So she's been writing for a long time, and this collects her work right up to her most recent collection, which is called Swimming with Cancer, which is an account of her cancer. So it's this kind of capacious book that collects her prose, her letters, also unpublished work. So letters to different authors like Fred Waugh, Daphne Marlatt, and so there's this kind of exchange and correspondence that goes on in it.
Yeah.
As well as her previously published work, like Watery Part of the World.
Fantastic. So this is really, like when you say collected works, it's really kind of as capacious as you could possibly have been. Tell me about your and Deanna's working together on this book. What is that collaboration like?
Yeah. We had, for several years before we started this work, kind of run into each other in different capacities at conferences or poetry events. And, you know, at some point, you know, we'd say like, oh, I'm reading Gladys Hindmarch's work and I'm really enjoying it. Me too. Yeah. And we had a couple of those and we were like, oh, we should follow up on that. And then finally we did. And it started with a digitized reel-to-reel tape, a recording that I had, and Deanna and I got together and we listened to it of Gladys Hindmarch in conversation with Warren Tallman when she was 29 years old in 1969. And we found a room and just listened to that tape together, and we started writing on the whiteboard things that we were hearing. And we brought, at the time we didn't have a name for it, but we eventually called it feminist close listening. Mm-hmm. And we started mapping these connections that we were hearing that Hindmarch was talking out amongst women writers and interventions that she was making. And we decided that was kind of the basis for you know, a collection like this. We approached Hindmarch together, and she was keen and amenable to having one of collected works come out with, I should say, it's from Talon Books in Vancouver. And that got us started on just really moving through the work, like the published work, but then also the archives at Simon Fraser that Deanna and I went to together. We spent a lot of time with Hindmarch at her house around the kitchen table with letters and materials, diaries, journals that Hindmarch hadn't deposited yet at Simon Fraser. So it was a process of listening, reading, and a lot of transcription because none of the digital files existed for these.
Right.
Yeah, so in a lot of cases we were transcribing oral interviews that were on the tapes, we were transcribing letters that were in the archives, we were OCRing the books, but then also correcting all the OCR. So it was a lot of work in terms of gathering the materials and also attending to some of the changes that Hindmarch wanted to make to the books.
Yeah, you sort of over the last few years while you've been working on this, I think in many ways you've talked about Deanna as a collaborator, but Hindmarch has also been essentially working as a collaborator on this collection as well.
Absolutely, and I should mention that there's a fourth person. There's many more people who are involved in this book, but a fourth person is, of course, Katrina Strang, who is the editor for the press and who we worked with really closely through the copy editing and proofreading stage. You know, our own attention has been to thinking about really tapes and recordings and what those sound recordings, kind of like the one that we're doing right now, capture in terms of like the labor and the affective labor in particular. That isn't necessarily captured in print often. So, what we're listening for in these tapes is the evidence of particularly gendered, the gendered affective labor, women doing the listening work, giving the editorial feedback, shaping books that they sometimes don't get credit for. And in fact, when you hear the tapes, you think, wow, they're almost co-editors or like co-authors of this piece. English literature, which tends to value single-authored monographs as the gold standard of research production. And so part of the theorization work is to say, like, this is what we're doing, and this is why. This is the feminist theory behind the collaboration. And so part of our decision to configure the authorship this way was because I had a tenure-track position. Deanna was a grad student. Our labor was equal in the production, but it meant more to her at her stage of her research career to have that first author credit than it did to me. So your work with Deanna, I suppose not at the beginning, but now, often comes under the umbrella of a big research project called Spoken Web. I'm also a research affiliate and have some collaborations with you and with other researchers as part of that project. Would you like to talk about the relationship between Spoken Web as a project, perhaps the way that this work fits into it? Yeah. Sure. So Spoken Web is, for folks who aren't familiar with it, it's a SSHRC, which is a federal grant agency, a SSHRC partnership grant, which means it's a 7-year project. It has 12 partner institutions across Canada. So a great number of collaborators, research collaborators, including both of us. And those 12 partner institutions each have a librarian and archivist and a literary researcher leading it. And then typically there's also some research collaborators who are involved to form that team. Each institution also has a collection of literary audio. Like, what is literary audio? In this case, it's magnetic tapes that were recorded really from the 1950s through to the 1980s or 90s. That were recordings of poetry readings. They were recordings of poetic lectures in the classroom. They were recordings of like people just hanging out like we're doing right now, talking about poetry, and deciding to record it for posterity. And so they're really, really interesting collections of literary audio. The catch, though, is that they are disintegrating. That media was meant to have a shelf life of about 50 years. And in many cases, they are like at or past their 50-year mark. And so it's absolutely vital to preserve them. So the project is about preserving and making accessible those particular tapes. What is gained from the digitization and what possibly is lost? And then how does the relationship of those kinds of other stories, other perspectives, other interventions and other forms of labor that is kind of
has like a fragile capture or a fragile trace on those media forms, what's happening to it then when we digitize them?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the collections that reside in different institutions across Canada are of public poetry readings, and that's a fascinating sort of set of a kind of inquiry in itself. We have at UBCO in the AMP Lab a collection of tapes that is growing. They are tapes that have been donated by a number of major Canadian authors: Fred Waugh, George Bowring, Sharon Thiessen, Frank Davey. We have Warren Tallman's tapes. They tend to be tapes that were made by the writers themselves. They're amateur. They were made, people suddenly had access to tape recorders, and they brought them places and they recorded things. Often kind of poetic conversations, sometimes things that were just, hanging out in the living room talking about poetry and literature. They're a little messier than the sort of like poetry reading series that has an individual writer or two that evening reading to an audience they knew they were reading in public, etc. We sometimes don't know what's on these tapes until we digitize them. So part of the project, as you said, as we're remediating them, we're moving them from analog to digital, is really that description process. And part of Spoken Web writ large as a project is thinking about like, how do we describe literary audio? What's the metadata that goes with this? And so we've been doing that work. It's been really important to us in the AMP Lab, and I think also across Spoken Web, but particularly because we have a lab space here, that the students are involved in digitizing so they can learn about that, the affordances of that magnetic tape media. And what we think about when we're remediating that is like, how do we capture some of those affordances, or how do we, when we move them into digital formats and when we're building a site, where the public can arrive on the site, how do we retain some of those elements of the analog and present them in a way that they can be worked with? So it's a way of kind of doing that public humanities work, where we bring the project, different aspects of the project, to the public in a way that's kind of fun, but also an opportunity to learn.
You've mentioned some things that you do in the AMP Lab. So maybe you'd like to tell us what the AMP Lab is, but also to think or to talk about like, what does it let you do? Why is it necessary for the research? How does it allow a different kind of research, if indeed it does allow a different kind of research?
Thanks. I mean, that's such a great question, because I think especially in the humanities, a lab is not an essential part of all humanists' work, but it is for those of us who are engaged in media archaeology, digital humanities. The lab is a space. It's like an office.
In some ways, it's like, especially the way the AMP Lab operates, in some ways it's like a studio, right? Because there is a creative dimension of not just the public outreach, but then also the digitization, the like intellectual engagement with the materials.
The AMP Lab also houses a number of other DH projects, and it is a DH lab that brings those projects together, where we learn from each other, and the students learn from each other, and we learn about like what tools you're using in your project, and maybe we'd like to use those tools in our project, and so could you give us a short workshop on them? And that's kind of the magic of the space as a collaborative research space. And we can learn so much from going back and thinking about like old media and how people were using tapes in pedagogy, at the mid-century or in radio.
So we keep talking about affective labor, especially affective labor in the lab and in relationships. What do you mean when you say that?
Affective labor is the labor that's done that allows for the reproduction of community. So it is the labor of listening, it is the labor of conviviality, of gathering, it is the labor of cooking and counseling and the being there that doesn't necessarily lead to a product output, if you will. But and it's often gendered. I mean, it's the kind of labor we do around in the academy as well. Of it's mentoring. It's listening to students, it's listening to colleagues, it's providing advice.
So many of those activities require feelings
Yeah.
to perform effectively, right? And from the sort of originary psychological definition of affect, that it's feeling and feeling in your body, right? Those embodied dimensions. So both of us, in addition to working in literature, work in a field called the digital humanities. For my part, I like to define it quite broadly. I like to say that it's essentially the intersection of the humanities and technology. And so that means that we ask questions about culture and history and our shared human lives, as well as thinking about the ways that the extensions of our human selves also shape those lives, right? So if technology is kind of any extension of human capacity, then we might talk about books, we might talk about tapes, we might talk about data. And that really expansive definition, for me, allows for sort of novel connections, like new ways of new or maybe even not new ways of thinking about culture, and literature, especially for both of our backgrounds. Is that where kind of within that great big definition, where do you see a lot of your work fitting?
I think about digital humanities as, and I think it's Kathleen Fitzpatrick who sort of says it's, a field where we bring humanities questions to thinking about technology, and technology into thinking about traditional humanist questions. For me, there's, I think, often thinking about ethics, the ethics of those digital tools. So especially around sound and sound studies, it's like, we could invent or create a digital tool, or we could bring AI into and machine learning into the Cultural Heritage Archive. And that would allow us to create synthetic voice or search, data mine, etc. And for me, that's exciting, but the question is always what are the ethics of doing that? And I think that's really an intervention where that digital humanists can make in, this kind of burgeoning field of AI, and think about what's at stake and for whom, and who consented to that, or whose consent is required. And what does it mean to create synthetic voice? If I can have you, 10 hours of your voice to train a machine learning algorithm, and I can have you speak anything after that. What does that mean, and how,
How does, I suppose, that shape our orientation towards the materials that we work with? Yeah.
And I think, especially, in conversations with other researchers and students, we think about those two, once you do it, you can't take it back. And so we need to think about these questions of, we can do this, should we do it? And I think that's a good lesson, or a good kind of thing for anybody working in technology, and to be thinking about.